Hello, guys. We are together again. We are, of course, in this very interesting discussion. Diskusi kita kali ini kembali dengan Bapak Gilberto, Bureau Chief ABC Australia. Pak Bill,
Thank
nice
you,
to
Pak
meet you
Iwan.
again, sir.
Thank you.
So we'd like to prolong actually this discussion with you, sir, on your impression over Indonesia as a country which is actually one of Australia's nearest neighbors, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
And yet another democracy, not necessarily the same with Australia. On the other hand, it's not necessarily the same as China, for instance, that has been under scrutiny, if I may say so, from the Western points of view. So, of course, Indonesia is different. Maybe you could share with us, Pak Bill, now to begin with. Having been in Indonesia so far, what are the things that have impressed you most? Covering on the political events or scenes, or rather different from that?
I think on politics, it's generally quite open here
Yeah.
to access people in power to ask them. Not maybe not sort of tycoons and very rich people, but although we weren't able to interview Prabowo, we were able to briefly interview. Well, ask a few questions to Gibran, to Ganjar. ABC interviewed Anis when he was in Australia. It seems like access to people in power for Indonesian media is relatively good.
Okay.
There's a relative level of openness, not just politicians, but institutions. Now, I'm sure under the surface, there are all sorts of issues like every other country, but I guess perhaps I've been up in China for so many years where it's the complete opposite. There's basically zero access to anybody in any position of power. So that I think is something that was quite refreshing during the campaign.
Yeah.
To sort of see that level of relative transparency, but I guess in a democracy you would expect that. Aside from that, we covered, for example, IKN, the new city up in Nusantara, up in.
You did the coverage on that.
We're doing a documentary on it.
Oh,
It hasn't gone to air yet.
Yep.
So I think a lot of Australians are quite interested in that idea.
Okay.
And that project. I think they're surprised by it.
Yep.
I think a lot of people are very curious about the rationale behind it.
Yep.
And why there is, or supposedly there is, a need to move the capital off Java. So we're interested in that because there's a lot of ambition in that project. Yep. You look at things like the high-speed rail that the Chinese-Indonesian consortium built from Jakarta to Bandung. The swoosh.
The whoosh.
The whoosh. Sorry. I know there are a lot of reporting about the economics of it not working out, but we've been on that train. It's a very good train.
Yep.
Will it be extended one day to Surabaya? Who knows? Obviously, the economics of it are a bit difficult, but it seems to me there is a lot happening. There's a real sort of buzz and energy in Indonesia, quite a lot of optimism, I would think, for just the future in general. And that, I think, is nice. That's somewhat refreshing, I guess. What else? I think those are the main things.
So I could imagine that you came here while more or less the political stability was sort of okay, particularly for the Indonesian people. And then, of course, it may not necessarily be the one most desirable, maybe by some foreign journalists, because less actions they could that you could possibly do because of the stable situation. But I agree with you that there are still, of course, other developments of interest, of course, such as the IKN project, as you explained, and the fast train, Bandung Jakarta, and probably the other or the next planned fast train route Jakarta Surabaya, for instance. Maybe other different project planned by the government. And now we know, on the other hand, aside from the planned projects. Of course, like in many other countries, the government has been facing, of course, oppositions towards their projects, including the ICANN in particular.
Yeah.
How would you say, or how could you say, the Australian public would see this ambitious project from the current leadership of Indonesia for this particular project, which is the new capital of the country,
Yeah.
which is far away, they say, in Kalimantan. Right?
Yeah, I think people do question whether it will succeed. I think they question it because the location.
Yep.
The location is, it's not in Java. Obviously, the idea is to spread economic growth to other islands, but it's sort of in the middle of some plantations in East Kalimantan. So there's this question about, will the political elites and their families and the bureaucrats from Jakarta really all move to East Kalimantan?
Yeah.
The cost, we've been up to IKN, we've been speaking to the Nusantara development, Pak Bambang and all the people running it. There clearly is an issue attracting foreign investment.
Yep.
They want 80% of it to come from private investors. The explanation is people are waiting for the election results to be clear, and then they hope that investment will come.
Yeah.
But so far, there obviously is some reluctance, at least by foreign investors, to go in. So there's that question as well about, can it be built without too many state funds? It's only supposed to be 20% of state funds.
Yeah.
Is that going to creep up like it did for the fast train? So there are questions about whether or not it's actually feasible and will it work? Will it actually grow to 1.7 to 1.9 million people by 2045? Can it actually be green and sustainable? These are all questions people abroad have. It's not doubts, it's questions.
Which is normal.
Yeah.
You would reckon it's normal that questions are arising.
Of course. But having gone there, I myself still don't know. I'm not sure if it can be pulled off because it is a very ambitious project.
Yeah.
But obviously with Prabowo and Gibran most likely to be confirmed as the next leadership team, you would assume that they will continue the project. It's what they've pledged. And for that reason, I expect the building will continue on. There's a deadline to have a little ceremony, I believe, in August for National Day.
Yeah. August 2024.
This year,
coming up actually this year.
Yeah, and so they need much of the presidential office to be completed for that.
Yeah.
There's some talk about maybe the transfer of the capital from Jakarta to EKN would happen by the end of 2024, although that's not confirmed. Everyone's very curious about the project.
Which is normal, right? That everyone is curious, considering all the complexities.
It's an interesting...
technically and also economically.
Very bold. It's a big plan.
It's very bold.
Yeah.
A very bold plan, yes.
So things like that, people are very interested in.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing that they do in China. They don't do these sorts of things in Australia, but they do these sorts of things in China. China's built a new city near Beijing, Seorang.
Some countries some countries would actually manage to succeed in building their new capital. A few other countries actually failed.
Myanmar, Brasilia.
Exactly, Brasilia.
That's why it's a question. That's of great interest to people overseas. The extension of the train line, if it ever happens, is also of great interest. It's a bit specific, but people who are following Indonesia's nickel industry are very interested in the policies of trying to create more jobs and wealth by refining nickel in Indonesia, getting Chinese investment and technical know-how. So that's interesting. There are a lot of interesting things going on here, but I think I've said the average person in Australia or many other countries probably don't know a great deal about it.
And they may not be necessarily that curious about the development in this aspect or in this sector in Indonesia.
We try to make them curious through our reporting, but it is difficult. You sort of see the show business of the US election and whatever else. So it's a bit trickier. These projects are kind of their infrastructure or their economic. It's a bit trickier to get people naturally to take an interest. But the people who, business people, diplomats, they definitely do take a big interest in it.
Bill, very last questions. Of course, I personally, as a journalist, would like to see the journalistic practices in Indonesia would further flourish, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, it will still be a long way to compare to what you are having in Australia, for instance, particularly. How do you perceive that? I mean, how would you envisage the Indonesian press in the future, especially when Indonesia has actually managed to maintain the stability politically with the election of the new president?
Look, I think Indonesian media that I've seen, particularly outlets like Tempo and Jakarta Post and some of those outlets.
Sorry, Bill, because some would criticize that the Indonesian media have been less critical.
Yeah. It does feel a bit like that to me, but then some of the outlets have seemingly been, particularly, for example, when Gibran was approved by the Constitutional Court by his uncle, right?
The MK, by his uncle.
Yeah. I felt, from what I could gather, there was quite a lot of media reporting, including very obvious questioning by journalists and media about it.
Yeah.
And then, then there was a subsequent ethics violation case for Usman. And so, to me, some of those kind of controversial political issues, it does seem like the Indonesian media is generally reporting on it. Once again, I'm looking at it from an outsider's perspective.
That's what I mean, yes.
So I don't know for sure. I think one thing that does appear quite obvious to me in this country is the very kind of close links between politicians and tycoons.
Yeah.
They call it sort of cronyism.
Yeah, the cronyism.
Feels like it's pretty prominent here, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure domestically how much the media really questions not just political people in power, but influential, wealthy people behind those in power.
The other term used by them, the oligarch.
The oligarchs. I'm not clear from what I see on whether or not there is the ability to kind of question those links closely. That's one I think only people reading the Indonesian domestic media every day can judge. But to me, that it does look quite obvious that there's a fair bit of that going on in the country. In Australia, not to say that there aren't links between rich, powerful people in Australia and politicians, but there are certainly transparency efforts, things like registers of political donations.
You think that the transparency in Indonesia is sufficient, in your opinion?
I've heard critics from...
As far as journalism practices is concerned?
Well, little things like you have these various citizens groups who are talking about the issues around this election, saying that there's a real issue in the last election about donations and funding for political campaigns and transparency about it. With claims by, what is it? I don't know if it's the KPU or one of the other organisations saying it's a violation of privacy to be disclosing who's funding campaigns. So there obviously are areas where people are concerned. Every country has this, sure, but this is something that was continually raised when I went to various forums covering the campaign. Little things like, the KPK was weakened a few years ago. You look at that from an outsider's perspective and say, well, an anti-corruption body is usually a positive thing, right? So I'm looking at it as an outsider, but it feels to me there are probably still some areas where a lot of these NGO groups and civil society groups are raising concerns.
Understandably, Bill, as you could imagine, as you could see around, that many Indonesian people have become very concerned about how this KPK, as the right institutions to fight against corruptions, have been operational lately. You think that there will be more criticism towards KPK, do you think, from the Western perspective?
I don't think outside the country many people or even governments are particularly interested in the domestic issues like that.
Okay.
I think, that was already, the KPK was already weakened a few years ago.
Yep.
I think if there was a very large, obvious regression of democratic institutions in Indonesia, then that would definitely raise concerns abroad. But I do think already over the past 10 years, according to critics and civil society groups, there's been a backsliding. That's the word they always use. People include the Constitutional Court giving the green light to Gibran despite the age limit, being able to run. They cite that as an example. The conflict of interest of the Chief Justice, the weakening of the KPK, issues around transparency of political funding in the most recent campaign. These are all the sort of things where people say, the democratic institutions are slightly weakening. Now, to be honest, under Prabowo Subianto, is there an expectation that will continue? I think overseas there probably is an expectation that things will continue on the same trend they are currently on. But if there was a big regression, that's when I think you'd get more focus from the overseas community.
Very last, Bill. So with all those realities or against those backdrops, would you believe that, or would you perceive that the Indonesian media and the media people would manage or would somehow experience a better working environment as far as transparency, press freedom is concerned?
I think there were expectations 10 years ago when Time magazine put Jokowi's face on the front and said, what was it, the hope of Asia or Indonesia or something or other. I don't feel this time around people who are particularly interested in, say, press freedom or human rights, I don't think they carry any particular expectation about the next 5 years and a Prabowo presidency. I think the expectation is simply that things will continue in roughly the same way that they're going. And as I said, if Indonesia's democracy continues to function in a way that is primarily democratic and where the institutions can function relatively well, then I think that's the expectation. If things go a bit off the rails, that's not the expectation, but if things go a bit more off the rails, that's when you'd see more concern from abroad. But as for Indonesia itself, issues like press freedom, obviously journalists always hope for more press freedom, more transparency. I don't get the sense that people are talking about that as an expectation this time around.
Clear.
Yeah.
I appreciate that very much, Mr. Bill Bertels. Thank you so much.
Thank
you so very much for all the insights. I appreciate a lot. Ya, terima kasih. Itu guys, itu tadi diskusi kita dengan Bapak Bill Bertels, Bureau Chief ABC Australia di Jakarta. Terima kasih, kita jumpa lagi pada lain kesempatan. Thanks guys. Salam.